The man I loved, the father of my child, chose my daughter-in-law over me and believed I'd disappear quietly. Even saying it aloud feels impossible, like speaking a truth too raw to be real. I spent decades building a life with him, side by side, through every storm that came our way. I was a young woman when we met, full of hope and love, dreaming of the life we could create together. And in those early years, love was enough to shield us from every hardship. Raising our son had been my proudest achievement. I poured my heart and soul into him, waking before dawn, working late into the night, making sure he had everything I had never had. I sacrificed so much, not out of obligation, but out of love. Every sleepless night, every lonely holiday, every quiet struggle was worth it because I believed I was shaping a future where our family would always remain unshakable. I believed in my husband too. I trusted him completely, never imagining the heartache that would come from the very hands I had held in love for decades. Together, we endured financial struggles, health scares, and the small betrayals life throws at everyone. Each time, I thought our bond grew stronger. I thought he would never betray the woman who had stood by him through every storm. When my son married, I felt a wave of joy I hadn't realized I had been holding back. I imagined him beginning his own family, carrying forward the lessons and love we had given him. I welcomed his wife with open arms, determined to nurture a bond that would make the family stronger. I told myself there was room for love all around, that together we could create a household full of warmth, laughter, and trust. But then came the subtle signs, small gestures, passing glances, tiny moments that gnawed at me, though I tried to ignore them. A touch that lingered too long, a smile meant for him that was too intimate. I brushed them aside, unwilling to imagine what they might mean. My heart refused to accept the whispers of doubt that crept in because love had taught me to trust, to hope, and to see the best in the people I cherished. Still, there was a tension I could not shake. My husband's laughter grew quieter around me, his smiles more fleeting. He began to find reasons to be elsewhere, even when nothing called him away. And her presence, my son's new wife, became increasingly bold, inserting herself into moments meant for me, speaking words that seemed harmless, but carried an edge I could not ignore. I wanted to believe it was all in my head. I wanted to trust the life we had built, the family we had nurtured. But deep inside, a seed of fear had taken root. And in that seed, I began to sense a truth I was not yet ready to face. Before we dive deeper into this story, may I ask a small favor? Please consider subscribing. It helps this channel grow. It encourages me to keep sharing real stories like this. And honestly, it means the world to me. The first hints were small, almost imperceptible, but they landed with a weight I could not ignore. A glance shared between my husband and my daughter-in-law lingered too long at the dinner table. A quiet laugh in the hallway that cut me out of a moment I had once been part of. I told myself I was imagining things, that perhaps it was just the excitement of a new marriage clouding my perception. I began noticing the little ways my routines were being interrupted. The home I had always managed with care, the spaces I had kept as a sanctuary, felt slightly altered. Her belongings in places I didn't remember placing them. Her voice filling rooms that had once echoed only with familiar warmth. I felt like a guest in my own home, and yet I hesitated to confront the feeling. It seemed too petty, too fragile to mention. Even my husband seemed different, though he masked it well. He spoke less often with me about our days, seemed distracted, and occasionally offered apologies that felt forced, as if trying to keep a delicate balance he was no longer sure he wanted to maintain. My son, blissfully unaware, continued to smile at his new life, and I found myself caught in a growing storm of unspoken words and uneasy silences. I tried to focus on the happy moments. I hosted family dinners, laughed at shared memories, and welcomed their presence as best I could. I reminded myself of the trust I had always placed in him, the man I had loved through so many trials. And yet, my heart tightened whenever I noticed a small shift. A brush of a hand, a pause too long, a warmth in a voice not meant for me. I began to watch them more closely, trying to convince myself I was only being cautious. But the seed of doubt had taken root, and it grew with every passing day. Each moment of perceived closeness between them chipped away at the comfort I had once known. Evenings became the hardest. Sitting quietly with a cup of tea, I would replay the day in my mind, examining every smile, every word, every touch, as if I could find an innocent explanation for what my intuition whispered. And yet, there were no explanations that could soothe the unease settling in my chest. It was in those moments, in the quiet of my home that had once been a sanctuary, that I began to sense the impossible, that my place, the life I had built, the family I had devoted myself to, might no longer be secure. And for the first time, a shiver of fear ran through me, the kind of fear born not from the unknown, but from a truth you are not yet ready to face. To truly understand the pain I felt as I watched my family shift around me, you need to know the life I had lived before this storm arrived. I was young when I married my husband. We didn't have much, but we had hope and an unwavering determination to build a future together. Every small success we achieved, every trial we endured, was earned through persistence, trust, and love. I believed in him completely, and I devoted myself not just to our marriage, but to the home we were creating, a home meant to nurture, protect, and shelter our family. Raising our son was the greatest joy of my life, but also the most demanding. There were nights I went without sleep while he cried, mornings I went hungry to make sure he had enough. I worked tirelessly, not for recognition, but because I knew the value of stability and love. Every sacrifice felt like an investment in a future where our family could thrive. I wanted him to grow up confident, kind, and secure, never doubting that he was surrounded by unwavering love. Through the years, I watched my husband grow, stood by him through his challenges, and bore the weight of our shared hardships silently. There were financial strains, health scares, and moments of fear that could have fractured us, but I held us together. I became the quiet anchor in our storm, the steady presence he could rely upon even when the world seemed to tilt. I had imagined my later years with him would be peaceful. We would sit together in the evenings, reminiscing about the life we had built, watching our son flourish and our family bond remain unbroken. I pictured laughter filling the home, gentle conversations lingering over cups of tea, and the satisfaction of knowing that every struggle, every sacrifice had been worthwhile. And yet, in the midst of these dreams, the subtle signs of change began to unsettle me. The home I had poured myself into, the place that was once my refuge, started to feel foreign. I could no longer recognize the warmth that had defined it. My husband's attention shifted. Small moments of intimacy became scarce, and the laughter I cherished was no longer shared between us. I clung to hope, reminding myself of the decades we had spent together, of the love we had cultivated. Surely it was only a phase. Surely the family we had built could withstand the growing unease. But deep down, I knew that the foundation of trust I had always relied upon was being tested in ways I could not yet understand. I had given everything, my youth, my energy, my heart. And it was this devotion that made the first true glance of betrayal hit me with a force I had never imagined possible. When my son first introduced his wife to me, I welcomed her with open arms. I had hoped to forge a bond, to extend the love and guidance that had nurtured our family for so many years. I imagined us laughing together, sharing stories, and building a household where all 3 generations could coexist in harmony. At first, everything seemed perfect. She smiled at me, helped with small household tasks, and even expressed admiration for the way I had raised my son. I allowed myself to believe that the new chapter would be just as filled with warmth as the years that had preceded it. But as weeks passed, subtle cracks began to appear. There were moments that felt off. Comments that hinted at judgment rather than appreciation, a lingering glance that made my heart tighten, a casual dismissal of my opinions in matters that once mattered. Each instance alone seemed insignificant, easily brushed aside, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Dinner tables became quieter, the conversations shifting in ways I couldn't control. My husband, once attentive and engaging, now smiled at her words more than mine. My son, caught between loyalty to both of us, seemed unaware of the changes but carried a subtle tension I could feel with every interaction. I tried to remain patient. I reached out to her, attempting small gestures of connection, offering advice, sharing family memories, encouraging her in her new role. But each attempt was met with indifference or veiled critique. Her words, though polite on the surface, carried an edge that left me uneasy. I began to notice the way she positioned herself closer to my husband, the small habits that placed me on the periphery of the very family I had built. Still, I wanted to see the best in her. I reminded myself that marriage was a learning process, that new relationships often carried growing pains. I thought perhaps that my husband's attention to her was natural, that she was simply finding her place. I clung to hope, as I always did, because giving up had never been in my nature. Yet, beneath the polite smiles and careful words, I felt a tension that refused to be silenced. The home I had spent decades creating, the sanctuary of my family, was subtly shifting around me. And even as I welcomed this young woman into our lives, I could not shake the uneasy feeling that my role, the place I had always held so dearly, was quietly being eroded. It was in those first months, in the moments too small for anyone else to notice, that the story of betrayal began. The pieces were falling into place, invisible to everyone but me, and I knew deep in my heart that nothing would ever be the same again. As the weeks turned into months, the unease in the house became almost tangible. I could sense a quiet alignment forming between my husband and my daughter-in-law, subtle but undeniable. They laughed softly together at things I wasn't part of, shared glances that lingered just a second too long. My heart would tighten, yet my voice caught in my throat whenever I tried to confront it. I started noticing patterns. How my suggestions were ignored, how my husband's attention drifted toward her in moments that had once been ours. Even my son, unaware of the undercurrents, seemed pulled by invisible forces, caught between the two most important people in his life. Every morning, I would wake with a flutter of hope that things might be as they once were, only for it to crumble with the first glance across the breakfast table. I began to watch silently, learning every subtle movement, every word that carried hidden meaning. It was like observing a play unfolding before me, one where I had no script, no power to intervene, and yet was at the center of its silent betrayal. I couldn't tell anyone, not my friends, not my family, because this was a quiet storm, a betrayal that would shock everyone when revealed. I had to endure it alone, to navigate the subtle cruelties and the shifting alliances without losing myself completely. And I feared what might happen if I looked away, if I allowed myself a single moment of complacency. Even in my solitude, my mind raced with questions I dared not speak aloud. How could someone I trusted so completely act in a way so hurtful? How could my husband, the man I had built a life with, allow this to happen under his own roof? And how could my daughter-in-law, my own son's wife, undermine the very family I had spent a lifetime nurturing? It was in these quiet, tense moments that I realized the story unfolding around me was far from ordinary. It would not be a small conflict, nor a passing quarrel. This was a betrayal that would shake the foundation of everything I had built, one that would challenge the very essence of who I was and force me to confront truths I had long avoided. And yet, even as fear and heartbreak began to seep into my days, a small ember of resolve glowed within me. I knew, even then, that no matter what was coming, I could not allow myself to be broken completely. My heart ached, yes, but I still had the power to endure, to watch, and to decide when the time came how I would respond. The storm was only beginning, and what happened next would change our lives forever. The household had changed in ways I could no longer ignore. My husband, once a man whose laughter filled every corner of our home, became distant. His smiles were fewer, his attention more selective. He found excuses to step out, to linger at work, to attend meetings that didn't exist, all while I remained in the quiet of the house, wondering where the man I loved had gone. The daughter-in-law, on the other hand, grew increasingly confident in her presence. Tasks I had once managed with care and routine were now interrupted or overridden by her suggestions. She positioned herself subtly, yet deliberately, in conversations and decisions. At first, I brushed it off as the natural confidence of someone learning the ropes of a new household. But her words carried a subtle superiority, an insistence that my voice, long respected, was now optional. It was a delicate dance of avoidance and assertion. My husband, while not openly hostile, allowed these small shifts to occur. He offered little defence, a nod here, a quiet agreement there, that felt more like consent than neutrality. It was as if the home I had nurtured was quietly being claimed by another, and I was expected to remain a spectator. Each day the tension grew. The daughter-in-law's gestures and comments, though outwardly polite, carried hidden jabs. She would critique meals I prepared, question traditions I had held for decades, and subtly challenge decisions I had always made for the household. I tried to address these moments gently, offering guidance or explaining my reasoning, only to be met with polite dismissal or veiled sarcasm. My son, oblivious to the undercurrents, continued to trust both his father and his wife. He was caught in the middle, smiling at both, unaware that the bond between the two most important people in his life had begun to fracture the very foundation of our family. His presence, which had once brought warmth, now carried an unintentional tension, as if he were the last link in a chain quietly unravelling. I tried to maintain normalcy, to keep our routines intact, but every effort seemed to push me further into the shadows. I felt invisible in my own home, like a ghost moving through the rooms I had spent decades shaping. Each passing day made me question my worth, yet I refused to let the fear of what I might find stop me from observing, from trying to understand what was happening around me. Even when I reached out to my daughter-in-law with gestures of kindness, inviting her to help with family tasks, sharing advice, or reminiscing about the son's childhood, she met me with indifference or quiet mockery. Each attempt to bond left me feeling smaller, as if my efforts to maintain connection only highlighted my diminishing place in the family. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a landscape of quiet tension. I began to navigate my days cautiously, measuring each word, each action, aware that a wrong step could deepen the growing divide. And yet, despite the sting of isolation, I held on to hope that reason and love could still restore what was slipping away. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet shifts in the household began to feel like walls closing in around me. My husband's absence became routine. He lingered in his office longer, claimed errands that seemed unnecessary, or simply retreated to a corner of the house where I could not reach him. When he was present, he spoke less, smiled less, and offered fewer moments of intimacy. The warmth we had once shared felt like a memory from another life. Meanwhile, the daughter-in-law grew bolder, asserting control over spaces and decisions I had always managed. Small things, like rearranging furniture, choosing which meals were served, or redirecting conversations, were done with an air of authority that I had never before seen from anyone in our home. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but the pattern became undeniable. She had a way of speaking that was always polite, yet carefully calculated. A compliment would mask a critique. A question would carry an unspoken challenge. My presence seemed less necessary, my opinions less valued, and my history in this home gradually diminished in importance. I began to feel like a visitor in my own life, a spectator watching others write the story I had once authored. Even my son, oblivious to the undercurrents, trusted both of them completely. His laughter, once a source of comfort, now highlighted the tension. He smiled at her suggestions and deferred to her opinions, assuming harmony between father and wife, never realizing the quiet betrayal taking place. I could see the strain in his gestures, the small frowns when decisions were difficult, and it made me ache to witness his unwitting participation in the divide. I began to question myself constantly. Was I imagining these tensions? Was I overreacting to what could be innocent interactions? But deep down, my instincts told me otherwise. I had spent a lifetime reading the subtle cues of human behavior, understanding when love and loyalty were present or absent. And these were not simple misunderstandings. They were signs of a shift that was slowly, deliberately pushing me aside. Attempts to reach out to my daughter-in-law only deepened the divide. I invited her into conversations, shared memories of my son's childhood, and offered guidance when she sought advice. Each effort was met with polite dismissal or a quiet superiority that stung more than words could express. Her presence, once welcomed, now felt like a test of endurance, one I was not yet ready to fail, but which chipped away at my spirit with every passing day. I tried to maintain composure, to continue performing my role as mother and wife, but it became increasingly difficult to ignore the subtle manipulations that now governed the household. I realized that I was no longer the center of this family. I was an observer, a shadow, a reminder of what had been. And even in my quiet moments, I wondered how long I could endure this tension before it consumed me completely. By now, the quiet tension in the house had reached a point where it was impossible to ignore. Every day felt like navigating a minefield, where a single word or gesture could provoke disapproval or resentment. I could feel my place in the family slipping further with each passing moment, and it was a pain unlike anything I had ever experienced. I tried to engage, to maintain connection, not just for my son, but for the man I had spent decades loving. I prepared meals with extra care, shared stories meant to elicit laughter, and sought moments of one-on-one conversation. Yet every effort seemed to be met with subtle resistance. The daughter-in-law would offer polite corrections, redirect attention, or introduce her own rules, effectively sidelining me from spaces I had once managed effortlessly. My husband, though no longer openly hostile, remained detached. He no longer defended my opinions or validated my presence. Even small acts of support that I had once taken for granted, a compliment, a shared smile, a casual touch, were now absent. His silence spoke volumes, louder than any argument or confrontation could. It was a quiet abandonment that hurt more than I expected. Even my son, caught between loyalty and naivety, began to mirror the household dynamics without realizing it. He assumed that his father's and wife's actions were acceptable, normalizing the subtle exclusion I was enduring. His smiles at their interactions, though innocent, reminded me that the people I loved most were now unknowingly contributing to my isolation. I found myself retreating inward, trying to protect the pieces of my heart that were being chipped away. Yet I also refused to be entirely invisible. I began documenting small incidents in my mind, details of the exchanges, the subtle glances, the tiny usurpations of authority. These memories would later serve as undeniable proof of what had been quietly occurring around me. At the same time, I made a conscious decision to continue reaching out, even if my efforts were rebuffed. I invited my daughter-in-law to share in family traditions, offered guidance when she sought it, and attempted to build bridges despite the widening gap. But each attempt only highlighted the difference between the woman I hoped to connect with and the one who now controlled our household dynamics. The house no longer felt like home. Rooms I had once arranged with care felt like stages for someone else's performance. Every gesture, every smile, every comment was measured, calculated, and designed in ways that made me question my place. And yet I remained vigilant, holding on to the hope that the love and loyalty that had defined my family for decades might still be restored. But deep inside, a quiet truth settled in my heart. The dynamics of the household were no longer what they had been. And as I moved through each day with cautious eyes and a watchful heart, I began to understand that the coming months would demand a resilience I had never needed before. There were moments that cut deeper than any argument could. At the dinner table, she would make casual remarks about the meals I prepared, disguised as concern or preference. "Maybe we should try something lighter tonight," she would say, her smile sweet, her words carefully chosen to make me question my abilities. My husband, once quick to defend or reassure, now offered nothing but a polite nod, as if my presence, or my feelings, were optional. In conversations about family matters, she positioned herself as the authority. Suggestions I had offered for years were brushed aside or reframed as outdated ideas. I found myself hesitating before speaking, weighing each word to avoid subtle reprimands or dismissals. Each small exclusion stung, not because it was loud or overt, but because it chipped away at the identity I had built for decades, the identity of mother, wife, and matriarch of my family. Even in casual moments, she found ways to assert her control. When I tried to share a memory or involve my son in a story from his childhood, she would interrupt with a question or comment designed to redirect attention to herself. I could feel the eyes of my husband and son subtly shifting toward her, validating her presence over mine. It was a silent coup, played out day after day, with precision and intent. Attempts to connect with my daughter-in-law outside of family obligations were met with indifference or veiled condescension. I invited her to help me with tasks, to share recipes or household tips, hoping to build a bridge, only to have my gestures dismissed or mocked ever so subtly. The sting of these small rejections accumulated, leaving me questioning my place in a home I had once ruled with love and care. I also noticed the subtle ways my husband reinforced her behavior. Small gestures, a smile here, a quiet agreement there, served as silent endorsements of her authority. It was not outright cruelty, but the absence of support felt heavier than any confrontation. I began to realize that the partnership I had believed in for decades had shifted, and that I could no longer count on his advocacy in moments when it mattered most. Despite the growing tension, I refused to surrender. I held on to my dignity and sought moments of calm, finding solace in quiet corners of the house or in memories of the life we had built. But the truth was undeniable. The dynamics had changed. I was no longer the center of the family I had devoted myself to. I was becoming an outsider in my own home. With each passing day, the quiet power she wielded grew more apparent, and I understood that the coming months would demand more strength and resilience than I had ever needed before. The foundation of my family was shifting beneath my feet, and there was no guarantee it could be restored. By now, the tension in the house was palpable. Each day brought a new reminder that the balance I had once trusted was gone. My husband's attention no longer felt like a steady presence. Instead, it was measured, fleeting, and often directed elsewhere. The daughter-in-law's influence continued to expand, her quiet authority shaping the household in ways I could no longer ignore. I began to notice how my son, without meaning to, reinforced the dynamic. He trusted both his father and his wife completely, never suspecting the subtle ways they had begun to align against me. His laughter, once a source of comfort, now underscored the growing divide. I could see him unwittingly participating in the shifting hierarchy, smiling at her suggestions and looking to her for guidance, even when it conflicted with what I had always done. The sense of invisibility grew heavier with each passing day. I moved through the house cautiously, aware that every gesture, every word, might be interpreted as a challenge to her authority, or worse, an obstacle to the quiet control she was asserting. Even in rooms filled with family, I felt a profound isolation, as if I were present in body but absent in spirit. It was during these moments of reflection that I began to understand the scope of the challenge before me. This was not a simple quarrel or a fleeting misunderstanding. The daughter-in-law had established herself as a force within the household, and my husband's silence, or subtle complicity, meant that I could no longer rely on the old dynamics to protect my place. I realized that my role in the family was being quietly rewritten, and I needed to prepare myself for the next stage of confrontation. Even as the frustration and hurt mounted, I held on to the small glimmers of hope that had always guided me. I reminded myself of the resilience I had built over decades, the the strength forged through hardships, sacrifices, and the countless challenges I had overcome. I would not allow myself to be erased quietly, and I began to steel my resolve for what was coming. Yet the question lingered, heavy in my heart. How far would this go? How much more of my presence, my dignity, and my voice would be diminished before something had to change? The answers were uncertain, but one thing was clear. The household I had once ruled with love and care had become a battleground, and I could no longer remain passive. The days ahead would test every ounce of patience, every thread of strength I had left. And though I did not yet know the outcome, I understood that my next decisions, how I responded, how I endured, and how I confronted this quiet betrayal, would shape the remainder of my life and the life of my family. The subtle jabs and quiet manipulations of the past months escalated into words that cut like knives. It began with casual remarks in private conversations, comments about how I was old-fashioned, how my ways no longer fit in a modern household, how my presence was becoming unnecessary. At first I tried to brush it off, believing that perhaps she was simply adjusting to her new role and did not realize the pain her words caused. But soon, the remarks became bolder, delivered in front of others with a calculated ease that left me feeling exposed. During family discussions, she would frame her opinions in a way that cast doubt on my decisions, my judgment, and even my past sacrifices. The polite tone could not disguise the contempt beneath, and the realization struck me like a cold wind. She was deliberately undermining me, and my husband was no longer defending me. At first, he remained subtle, nodding at her statements, offering quiet agreement in moments where he once would have stood by my side. But it did not stop there. Gradually, he became more openly supportive of her words, siding with her in conversations, laughing at comments meant to belittle me, and offering explanations that excused her behavior while leaving me out of the equation. The home I had spent decades building now felt like a place where my voice no longer mattered. Even my son, the one person I had always believed would see the truth, remained silent. He either did not recognize the betrayal unfolding in front of him, or he refused to acknowledge it. His loyalty to both his father and his wife, though understandable in his eyes, left me feeling utterly isolated. The bond with my only child, the relationship I had poured everything into, was weakening with each passing day, and the pain of that realization was almost unbearable. I tried, once again, to maintain a semblance of normalcy. I offered guidance in household matters, attempted to engage in meaningful conversation, and sought opportunities to remind my family of the love and care that had always been the foundation of our home. But my efforts were met with indifference, subtle mockery, or open dismissal. It became increasingly clear that the household dynamics had shifted irrevocably, and that I was no longer at the center of the family I had nurtured. The emotional weight of these moments pressed down on me. Every glance, every laugh shared between my husband and daughter-in-law, every silence from my son became a reminder of how far I had been pushed to the margins. I realized with a growing ache in my chest that endurance alone could no longer sustain me. The subtle betrayals, the quiet manipulations, and the open support of my husband for her cruel remarks had brought us to a breaking point. Comment below. If you were in her shoes, would you stay and fight for your place, or walk away to protect your peace? As days passed, the daughter-in-law's attacks became more brazen. What had once been subtle jabs now turned into direct remarks about my behavior, my habits, and even my place in the family. She labeled me unnecessary during casual conversations, questioned my decisions openly, and ridiculed traditions I had cherished for decades. Each comment was like a small dagger, deliberately aimed at undermining the foundation of my home and my sense of self-worth. My husband, who had once been my shield, now laughed quietly at her jokes, offered explanations that excused her behavior, and even agreed with her critiques in ways that made my heart sink. His silence was no longer subtle. It was a quiet complicity that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about our marriage. The home I had once felt safe in was now a landscape of judgment, and the people I loved most had become agents of my pain. Even my son, innocent yet unaware, contributed to the strain. He laughed at remarks meant to humiliate me, nodded at suggestions that undermined my authority, and seemed to trust both his father and wife blindly. I longed to reach him, to explain the betrayal unfolding under his very eyes. But he remained distant in his understanding, caught between love for both parents and oblivious to the damage being done. The bond I had nurtured with my only child, my most precious relationship, was fraying, and with each passing day the distance grew wider. I began to feel invisible. Rooms I had once filled with laughter and warmth now echoed with a coldness that seemed impossible to escape. Even when I spoke, my words were met with polite smiles that carried no meaning, or with quick dismissals that left me questioning my own judgment. I realized that the place I had always held in my family, the center of decision, the heart of the home, was slipping through my fingers, and there was little I could do to stop it. Yet, in the midst of this growing despair, I clung to my dignity. I reminded myself that I had endured hardship before, that I had faced challenges far greater than this, and that I possessed the strength to survive even when those I loved most seemed to turn against me. I could not allow myself to be erased quietly. I had to endure, observe, and prepare for the moment when I would reclaim control over my own life. Every day became a test of patience, every interaction a balancing act between self-preservation and maintaining appearances. I felt trapped in a home that no longer welcomed me, and yet I could not abandon the people I had devoted my life to without first understanding the full scope of what was happening. The tension had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored, and I knew, deep in my heart, that the breaking point was fast approaching. The moment that finally shattered the delicate balance of my endurance came unexpectedly, yet it had been building quietly for months. It was a family gathering, one of those events meant to celebrate love, connection, and tradition. I had spent hours preparing, ensuring that every detail reflected care and respect for our family. I had hoped that this gathering might bridge the growing distance, restore some warmth to relationships fraying under tension. Instead, it became the stage for my deepest humiliation. The daughter-in-law, emboldened by months of subtle manipulations, took the opportunity to make comments that were sharp, cruel, and deliberate. She questioned my contributions, mocked my traditions, and made remarks about how the household would function better without my input. Her words were not hidden or disguised, they were spoken clearly with the precision of someone intent on asserting dominance. My husband, who had once been my partner in all things, offered no defense. He laughed quietly at her jabs, nodded at her critiques, and even added a few justifications of his own that deepened the sting. The silent complicity of the man I had loved for decades cut deeper than any overt attack. I realized in that moment that the home I had built, the family I had nurtured, was no longer a place where I could be safe, respected, or valued. Even my son, my only child, remained frozen in the middle, unaware of the full weight of the betrayal. He smiled nervously, attempted to diffuse tension, but ultimately contributed to the atmosphere that made me feel smaller with every passing second. His loyalty to both his father and his wife, though innocent, left me feeling utterly alone. The bond I had cherished with him, the connection I had nurtured since his birth, was slipping away in ways I could neither prevent nor repair in that moment. I felt my heart tighten, my chest ache, and a profound exhaustion settle over me. Every ounce of patience I had clung to, every attempt to maintain dignity in the face of growing disrespect, had reached its limit. I realized that staying would only prolong the pain, that enduring silently under the same roof with people who no longer valued me was a form of slow erosion. In that moment, I made a quiet, irrevocable decision. I would no longer remain in a place that stripped me of my dignity, mocked my sacrifices, and diminished my worth. The home I had devoted decades to was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a battleground where love and loyalty were weaponized against me. I stood up carefully but firmly, feeling the weight of the years behind me and the resolve within me. I would leave, not out of defeat, but out of self-respect. My family would not understand, perhaps, the depth of the betrayal I had endured. But I knew that peace, dignity, and the preservation of my soul required me to step away. After that gathering, I returned to the quiet of my home. Yet the echoes of humiliation lingered. Each room seemed to whisper the memory of the daughter-in-law's words, my husband's silence, and my son's unknowing participation. I sat alone, reflecting on the months that had brought me to this point, the subtle manipulations, the quiet betrayals, and the erosion of respect that had crept in like a slow, relentless tide. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully feel the heartbreak. It was not just the disrespect or the overt cruelty, it was the loss of the family dynamic I had once cherished. The laughter, the shared meals, the warmth that had defined our home, all of it felt distant, replaced by tension, avoidance, and judgment. I grieved not only the shift in my husband and daughter-in-law's behaviour, but also the widening gap with my son, the bond that had once been unshakable, now strained to the breaking point. Yet within that grief, a clarity emerged. I realised that endurance alone was no longer enough. The home I had created and the family I had nurtured could no longer serve as a place of comfort or belonging. To remain would be to surrender my dignity, to accept the quiet diminishment of my worth. And though leaving would be painful, the alternative, continuing under the same roof while being disrespected and undermined, was no longer acceptable. I began the process of preparing, both emotionally and practically. I thought through every detail, how to maintain my composure, how to gather my belongings, and how to step away with grace and dignity. Each decision was deliberate, a testament to the strength I had cultivated over a lifetime. Though my heart ached at the thought of leaving my son behind, I knew that self-respect and peace must come first. As I packed, memories surfaced. My son's first steps, his laughter at bedtime, the milestones I had celebrated with unwavering devotion. The home, filled with decades of love and sacrifice, felt heavy with emotion. But I reminded myself that the love I had given was not diminished by the choices of others. My life, my dignity, and my peace were mine to protect, and no one could take that away. By the end of that day, the path forward was clear. The breaking point had arrived, and with it, the necessity of action. I could no longer remain passive, nor could I continue to endure the slow erosion of my presence in my own family. The next steps I would take would define not only my future, but also the boundaries I would no longer allow to be crossed. I resolved in that quiet, painful moment that I would walk away, not in defeat, but in strength. And though the journey ahead would be difficult, it was the first step toward reclaiming the dignity and respect that had been quietly stripped from me. The morning light streamed through the windows, but the warmth it usually brought felt absent. I sat quietly, surrounded by the familiar walls of the home I had spent decades building, and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Every memory of laughter, milestones, and late-night conversations with my son reminded me of what I had nurtured, yet every glance from my husband and daughter-in-law reminded me of how quickly it had been undermined. I reflected on my heartbreak, the knowledge that the man I had loved for so many years, the father of my only child, had chosen to side with someone else over me. The betrayal cut deep, but beneath the sting of abandonment lay another feeling, one I could not ignore: the need for dignity. I had sacrificed, loved, and devoted my life to this family, and I would not allow myself to be diminished any further. With a heavy yet determined heart, I began to pack my belongings. Each item I folded, each memory I carefully placed into boxes, carried a weight of bittersweet emotions. Photographs of birthdays, letters written long ago, small mementos of shared joy. They all served as reminders of a life I had loved fiercely. Yet I knew that staying would mean leaving pieces of myself behind in a home where I was no longer valued. The act of packing became almost meditative, a ritual of reclaiming control. Each item placed in its box symbolized a part of my life that I refused to let be diminished by others. I did not rush. I did not panic. I moved with quiet purpose, understanding that this departure was not an escape, but a deliberate choice to preserve the respect and dignity I had earned through decades of love and sacrifice. Even as I prepared to leave, memories of raising my son in this very house flooded my mind. I recalled his first steps across the living room, the bedtime stories that made him laugh until tears ran down his cheeks, and the countless moments of guidance, patience, and unwavering support I had given him. Each recollection was a bittersweet reminder of the life I had invested so fully, and yet also a testament to the strength that had carried me through those years. By the time my belongings were gathered, I felt a quiet resolve settle over me. I would not leave as someone broken, though the ache in my chest was real. I would leave as someone who understood her worth, who knew the value of the life she had built, and who refused to allow disrespect or betrayal to define her. The departure would be dignified, silent, and deliberate, a statement of strength that would speak louder than words ever could. As I moved through the rooms, each familiar corner carried echoes of the past. The kitchen, once filled with laughter, and the aroma of meals prepared with care, now felt heavy with unspoken tension. The living room, where I had spent countless evenings sharing stories with my son and husband, seemed cold and distant. Every space reminded me of the life I had built and the love I had given, only to have it diminished in silence. I thought of the countless sacrifices I had made over the years, late nights caring for a sick child, the endless attention to household needs, the quiet support for my husband's ambitions. All of it had been offered freely, without expectation of reward. Yet now, as I prepared to leave, it became painfully clear that much of it had been taken for granted. The gratitude I had hoped for was absent, replaced instead by subtle contempt and disregard. The grief that settled over me was silent, yet profound. I did not cry loudly. There were no tears shed for dramatic effect. Instead, I felt the ache deep within, a quiet mourning for the love I had given, the home I had nurtured, and the family I had trusted with my heart. It was a grief that belonged not only to what had been lost externally, but also to the recognition that my devotion had been undervalued by those I cherished most. Memories of my son as a child flooded my mind. His first words, the nights I stayed awake soothing his fears, the milestones celebrated with joy and care. I remembered how I had shaped the home into a sanctuary, a place of comfort and love, believing that this foundation would secure a lifetime of shared happiness. Yet the present reality was a harsh contrast, a reminder that even the most steadfast love could be misunderstood, overlooked, or betrayed. In that quiet reflection, I realized something essential. My life, my sacrifices, and my love were still mine. Their inability to appreciate or honor them did not diminish their value. I carried within me the strength of decades of devotion, the resilience forged through challenges, and the wisdom of a life lived fully. Leaving the home did not erase these truths. It affirmed them. As I stood in the hallway, suitcase in hand, I felt a sense of empowerment mixed with sorrow. I was leaving behind not just walls and furniture, but the illusion that love alone would guarantee respect. I was stepping into the unknown, yet I was guided by a deeper understanding of my own worth. The grief remained, but it was tempered by clarity, dignity, and the quiet strength that had brought me this far. The moment of departure arrived with a quiet solemnity. I walked through the front door with my belongings in hand, the familiar latch clicking behind me like the final punctuation of a chapter in my life. Each step I took felt weighted with memories, years of devotion, countless sacrifices, and the love I had poured into a family that now seemed to no longer see me. Behind me, the house was filled with stunned silence. My husband and daughter-in-law believed they had finally pushed me away, that the woman they had dismissed, undermined and belittled had disappeared, weakened and broken. They did not see the determination in my eyes, the steady resolve in my posture, or the quiet fire that still burned within me. They assumed my departure was the end, not realizing that it marked a beginning, a reclaiming of my own life, my own dignity, and my own peace. I did not speak, nor did I look back. Words would have been wasted. Explanations would have served no purpose. My presence had been undervalued for far too long, and my dignity demanded a departure untainted by anger or argument. I carried with me the knowledge that leaving was not defeat. It was a choice of strength, a refusal to allow disrespect to define the remainder of my life. With each step down the familiar path that led away from the home I had built, I felt the tension slowly lift from my shoulders. The air outside was crisp and refreshing, carrying with it a sense of freedom I had not felt in years. The quiet grief of leaving mingled with a newfound clarity. I would no longer endure treatment that chipped away at my worth. I would no longer allow the decisions of others to dictate my peace. Even as the house receded from view, I remembered the life I had lived within its walls, the laughter of my son, the quiet conversations with my husband before the fractures began, the simple joys of shared meals and celebrations. These memories were mine to keep, untouchable by betrayal or disrespect. Though the physical space belonged to them, the love and effort I had invested remained indelibly imprinted in the heart of my life. I walked forward with quiet strength, each step a declaration of self-respect. The pain of separation from my family was real, yet it was tempered by the knowledge that I had chosen peace over suffering, dignity over humiliation, and self-worth over silent endurance. I left not as someone defeated, but as someone empowered, ready to face the world on her own terms. The house, the husband, and the daughter-in-law remained behind, unaware that the woman they believed gone had simply stepped into her own power. And in that silent, deliberate exit, I discovered a freedom I had not known in years, a freedom built on strength, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to honor myself above all else. Outside the walls of the home I had built, the world felt both unfamiliar and liberating. The familiar sights and sounds of the neighborhood reminded me of countless memories, yet walking away gave each memory a new perspective. No longer was I bound by the invisible chains of disrespect, indifference, and betrayal. For the first time in months, I felt a quiet sense of control returning to my life. Grief still lingered. There was no denying it. I mourned the loss of the family dynamic I had cherished, the bond with my son that felt frayed, and the years of effort and love that had gone unrecognized. But alongside the sorrow, there was a deeper understanding. Leaving was not abandonment, but an act of preservation. I was choosing to protect the integrity of my spirit, even as my heart ached at the thought of the people I was leaving behind. Each step forward carried a mixture of sorrow and resolve. The pain of betrayal was tempered by the clarity that staying would only prolong suffering. I realized that endurance alone had not sufficed. It had only made me more aware of how much I had been taken for granted. Walking away was a conscious choice to reclaim my dignity, a declaration that my life and my worth could not be diminished by the actions of others. I paused for a moment on a quiet street, taking a deep breath and allowing the emotions to settle. There was sadness, yes, but also a quiet pride in the decision I had made. I had walked away not as someone defeated, but as someone who understood her own value. I had endured long enough to see the true nature of the household dynamics, and now I was free to define my own path. Even as I carried the weight of separation from my family, a subtle sense of hope began to emerge. Life beyond those walls held possibilities I had forgotten in the years of devotion and compromise. I could rediscover parts of myself that had been overshadowed by conflict, cultivate peace in my own life, and find strength in solitude. The journey ahead would not be easy, but it was mine to navigate, and that realization brought a quiet, sustaining comfort. By the end of that day, I felt a delicate balance between grief and empowerment. I had left behind more than just a home. I had left behind patterns of behavior, expectations, and compromises that had eroded my sense of self. But in doing so, I had gained something far more valuable, the beginning of freedom, the reclamation of my dignity, and the first steps toward a life defined by my own choices rather than the actions of those who had failed to honor me. With each passing moment, I could feel the weight lifting, and though the road ahead was uncertain, I was ready to embrace whatever came next, with quiet strength, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to preserve the dignity I had fought so hard to maintain. The first few days after leaving were heavy with solitude. I returned to a quieter life, one that was unfamiliar and somewhat lonely. The absence of the family I had devoted so many years to created a void that echoed in the smallest moments. Empty chairs at the table, quiet evenings without familiar laughter, and the faint, lingering ache of missing my son. Each day, the memories of the home I had walked away from returned in fragments, reminding me of both love and betrayal. Yet in that stillness, a new awareness began to emerge. For the first time in years, I could focus entirely on myself, not as a mother or wife, but as a woman whose worth extended beyond her family roles. I started small, taking walks in quiet places, reading books I had long set aside, and reconnecting with old friends who reminded me of who I had been before life's burdens consumed my days. Each small act of self-care became a step toward rediscovery. I joined a local group where I found laughter, shared experiences, and unexpected support. There were hobbies I had neglected, painting, cooking for joy rather than obligation, and even volunteering in ways that gave my days meaning. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the sense of empowerment and fulfillment began to replace the emptiness. The healing was quiet, but real. I was learning to value myself for the person I was, not just the roles I had played. Through this process, I also came to understand the strength I had cultivated through years of endurance. The betrayal and heartbreak, though painful, had not broken me. They had revealed the resilience and courage that had always been within me. I could face the world alone, and in that realization I found a deep, sustaining peace. Back in the household I had left, the dynamics began to shift, but not in the way my husband and daughter-in-law had expected. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface began to boil over. Arguments erupted over trivial matters, jealousy flared, and the cracks in the relationship became impossible to ignore. The household, once a place of calculated control for them, now felt like a pressure cooker ready to burst. My son, who had been largely oblivious while I was present, began to notice the change. He witnessed heated exchanges that were more than ordinary disagreements, words laced with resentment, subtle manipulations, and moments of dishonesty that could no longer be ignored. The man he had trusted, his father, and the woman he had respected, his wife, were no longer the united front he had believed in. Something had shifted, and for the first time, he sensed that the truth he had overlooked might be far darker than he had imagined. He began asking questions, seeking explanations that went unanswered. The distance I had felt from him while living under the same roof seemed ironic now. His eyes were finally opening to the reality that had been hidden in plain sight. He saw glimpses of the betrayal I had endured, the favoritism, the secretive behavior, the small, cruel victories his father and wife had taken at my expense. Every revelation shocked him more deeply. He had trusted blindly, assuming loyalty and love where there was only deception. The realization that his father had betrayed me with someone so close to him left him stunned, conflicted, and full of guilt. My absence had suddenly become undeniable, and he began to understand, perhaps too late, the depth of what had been lost. Not only the bond with me, but the integrity of the family he had taken for granted. The son's awakening set the stage for a reckoning. As he pieced together the events he had ignored or failed to see, the household became increasingly unstable. The arguments intensified, the lies unraveled, and the tension reached a point where no one could continue pretending that all was well. My departure, once seen as a weakness, now loomed as a silent testament to the truth, an unyielding reminder of the betrayal that had been concealed for so long. The revelation came unexpectedly, yet it carried the weight of inevitability. Friends and neighbors, who had quietly observed the tension for months, finally spoke up, providing evidence and accounts that confirmed what had long been suspected but never openly acknowledged. The betrayal could no longer be hidden behind smiles, excuses, or carefully constructed facades. The truth was undeniable. My husband had chosen my daughter-in-law over me, not in a fleeting moment, but in deliberate, sustained acts that undermined everything I had built and sacrificed for. The impact on the family was immediate and profound. My son, who had once trusted both his father and wife implicitly, was devastated. The realization that those he had loved and relied upon had orchestrated such deception left him shaken to his core. Questions poured out in frantic bursts. Why? How could this happen? And most painfully, why was I absent when all this was occurring? For my husband and daughter-in-law, the exposure brought shame unlike anything they had anticipated. The careful control, the hidden manipulations, the assumption that I would disappear quietly, all of it crumbled in the face of undeniable proof. Their confident smiles vanished, replaced by panic, regret, and a dawning understanding of the depth of the wrongs they had committed. The household, once ruled by their schemes, was now consumed by chaos and remorse. When the truth finally reached them, it shook every foundation they had taken for granted. Relatives and neighbours who had long suspected discord now confronted them with clarity. The magnitude of their betrayal was laid bare, and the emotional weight was unbearable. My absence, once assumed to be weakness or resignation, now carried the quiet strength they could not comprehend. They saw, perhaps for the first time, that I had walked away not out of defeat but out of dignity and self-respect, qualities that exposed their own failures in the harshest possible light. My son, overwhelmed by grief and guilt, reached out to me. His voice, once hesitant and uncertain, trembled with desperation. He could not erase the months of pain I had endured, nor undo the consequences of the choices his father had made. But he sought acknowledgement, understanding, and, above all, my forgiveness. The family that had once dismissed my worth now found themselves at the mercy of my response, desperately hoping for the grace I had cultivated in solitude. The hidden truth, though painful to recount, illuminated a path forward. I realized that my life had been filled with lessons far greater than any betrayal could diminish. Strength, dignity, resilience, and self-respect were not merely abstract concepts. They were the foundation that allowed me to endure, to leave, and to observe the consequences of actions without losing myself in bitterness or anger. And so, as the family grappled with the enormity of what had been revealed, I stood apart, quietly reclaiming the narrative of my life. Their tears, apologies, and pleas were a stark contrast to the silence I had endured, yet they served to affirm a truth I had long known. No one could dictate my value, my choices, or the peace I had fought so hard to achieve. As the dust of revelation settled, I felt a profound shift within myself. The turmoil that had once threatened to consume me was now replaced with clarity and empowerment. I realized that my journey had never been about revenge, confrontation, or making others suffer. It had always been about reclaiming my own life, my peace, and my dignity. The betrayal I endured, though devastating, had shown me the strength I possessed and the limits I would no longer allow others to cross. Life after leaving had allowed me to rediscover who I truly was beyond the roles of wife and mother. I revelled in the small joys that I had set aside for decades, reading late into the night, laughing freely with new friends, and pursuing hobbies that nourished my spirit rather than my obligations. I cultivated spaces of warmth, care, and creativity in my own life, reminding myself daily that my value was inherent, not dependent on the recognition or betrayal of others. The son, now confronted with the undeniable truth, became a witness to my resilience. He saw how I had not crumbled under the weight of heartbreak, how I had refused to allow humiliation or betrayal to define me. His remorse and newfound understanding only deepened my conviction that I had made the right choice. My absence was not a punishment, It was a boundary, a declaration that respect and self-worth could never be compromised for the sake of appearances or familial obligation. In the days and weeks that followed, the household that had once felt so secure in its manipulations began to unravel. The husband and daughter-in-law, now confronted with the consequences of their actions, experienced the shame and regret they had long avoided. The very stability they had relied upon was gone, replaced by chaos and introspection. Watching this, I felt no satisfaction in their suffering, only a serene acknowledgement that actions have consequences and that integrity cannot be overridden by deceit. My own transformation was quiet but profound. I no longer measured my worth by the approval or attention of those who had betrayed me. Instead, I measured it by the peace I had cultivated, the dignity I had preserved, and the strength I carried forward into each new day. The freedom to live authentically, to embrace joy without compromise, and to honor my own values became the defining feature of this chapter of my life. And as I looked toward the future, I understood something vital. The betrayal that once threatened to break me had instead become the catalyst for growth. It had stripped away illusions, tested my resilience, and ultimately revealed the power within me to shape my life on my own terms. I had endured, I had walked away, and I had emerged not weakened, but stronger, wiser, and more certain of my worth than ever before. The family that had once dismissed me now trembled under the weight of truth, and I stood apart, fully empowered, a living testament to the strength that comes from honoring oneself above all else. My journey of transformation was complete, yet it was only the beginning of a life defined by peace, dignity, and unshakable self-respect. The day they came to see me, the weight of guilt was tangible. My son, usually so confident and assured, now stood before me with eyes full of sorrow. His voice trembled as he spoke, pleading for my forgiveness, for understanding, and for a chance to mend what had been broken. The depth of his remorse was overwhelming, and yet, even in that moment, I could feel the lingering ache of the months I had endured in silence. Behind him, my husband and the daughter-in-law appeared as well, faces marked by shame, voices soft with regret. Their carefully constructed confidence had crumbled, leaving only raw recognition of the consequences of their actions. They too asked for forgiveness, not merely as a formality, but as an acknowledgement that they understood the pain they had caused. The sight of their despair reminded me of the years I had spent nurturing and loving a family that had once failed to see my worth. Despite their pleas, I felt a calm settle within me. Their tears, though moving, could not erase the betrayal I had experienced, nor the months of emotional isolation I had endured. Yet in that calm, I realized that forgiveness, if it were to be given, was not for their sake alone. It was a choice I could make for myself, a release from the burden of anger and resentment that could otherwise linger indefinitely. I listened as they spoke, their voices shaking, their words raw and vulnerable. And while my heart ached at the recognition of lost time and fractured relationships, I also felt the quiet strength of the woman who had endured, left, and rebuilt her life on her own terms. Forgiveness, if it came, would not be a return to the past, but a conscious act to free my own spirit and preserve the dignity I had fought so hard to maintain. I sat quietly, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. The tears of my son, the trembling voices of my husband and daughter-in-law, each conveyed the regret that words alone could never fully capture. Yet I knew that my healing was not dependent on their remorse. It was rooted in the quiet strength I had cultivated over months of solitude, reflection, and personal growth. Pain had been my companion through this journey, a reminder of betrayal, loss, and the fragility of trust. And yet that pain had also shaped me, revealing the resilience that had always existed beneath the surface. I had endured the deepest hurts, walked away from what I loved most, and emerged with a clarity that few could understand. My dignity, once challenged and tested, now stood firmly unshaken. Forgiveness became a thought not for them, but for me. It was not a return to the life that had caused such sorrow, nor a reopening of wounds for the sake of reconciliation. Instead, it was a deliberate release, an acknowledgement that holding on to bitterness would only weigh down my own spirit. To forgive was to reclaim peace, to honour the journey I had endured, and to step forward without the burden of lingering resentment. I looked at the faces before me, each filled with shame, each seeking absolution, and felt compassion, tempered by wisdom. I could extend forgiveness, not as a submission to their wrongdoing, but as an affirmation of my own strength. In doing so, I understood that true power lies not in retaliation or revenge, but in the ability to rise above betrayal and protect the sanctity of one's own soul. The room was silent, save for the occasional sob or whispered apology, and in that silence, I felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by the quiet empowerment of a woman who had endured, who had walked away, and who now stood firmly in the knowledge of her own worth. As I stood there observing the remorse and anguish in the faces before me, I realized that life had offered a profound lesson. Love and loyalty, though powerful, must never come at the expense of one's own dignity. The years of sacrifice, the heartbreak of betrayal, and the courage to walk away had all led to this moment of clarity. I had endured the unimaginable and emerged not as a victim, but as a woman strengthened by her own choices. The family's pleas echoed in my mind, but my heart was steady. Forgiveness, if it were to be given, would be a gift to myself first, a release from the chains of anger and sorrow that could otherwise linger indefinitely. I understood now that peace was not found in the approval of others, but in the embrace of one's own worth. My strength was not measured by the tears of those seeking absolution, but by the quiet empowerment that had carried me through every trial. I looked directly into the camera, imagining the countless viewers who, like me, had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and the struggle to be seen and valued. And I asked them, not as a challenge, but as a reflection, would you have endured the betrayal just to keep the family together, or would you walk away to protect your own soul? It is a question that resonates deeply because it confronts the core of what it means to honour oneself. To endure may seem noble, but to recognise when love and loyalty are being exploited and to step away is an act of courage that defines the strength of a person. There is no shame in choosing oneself, no failure in prioritising peace over chaos, and no betrayal in protecting the spirit that carries us forward. If my story resonates with you, if you believe that every woman deserves dignity, respect, and the freedom to preserve her soul, then take a moment to subscribe, like, and share. Let these stories serve not only as entertainment, but as a reminder that strength, resilience, and self-respect are always within reach, even in the face of the deepest heartbreak. And as the screen fades, remember this: walking away does not mean giving up. It means rising, protecting your essence, and choosing a life defined by your own values, your own peace, and your own unwavering strength.